Hello, and welcome to my little guide video. I've seen a lot of attention come to Terra Invicta from a lot of different strategy uh, YouTubers such as Potato and Parun and whatnot. So I imagine there's a little bit of attention for this game, but it's quite complicated. So I understand some people might have a lot of difficulty getting into it, especially if you skip the tutorial. Like, admittedly, I did. No judgment. It's got a lot of overlapping details that can be a little bit confusing in these menus, but well, I've put a few dozen hours into it now, and I tend to try and read and understand this stuff. So hopefully, I can present a lot of this information in a way that's coherent and usable in your games and what have you. I just want to talk about the various incomes and influence in some of these resources and how you get them and how you use them in these countries you control, how to determine what's a good country and what's a good country for what, and various things. Starting with the obvious. Most people understand that this economy system, this prioritization system, very important, and that this reflects the GDP of the country. It pretty plainly says so. You're dividing your GDP into growth, and once it passes this number, it does stuff that's good. And most people know that, and they highly prioritize some big GDP countries. China, India, very good examples, but also places like, the European Union via France, the United States, etc., etc. But it seems like a lot of people seem to be missing very important details about the nature of how exactly these bonuses are determined and how these numbers are raised. And many of these numbers here, I don't think funding, perhaps not spoils. I haven't looked into that one yet. But a lot of these numbers determine the value they give based on the population of the country you're affecting. For instance, economy here. Don't know if it says it exactly. Oh, here it is. Yes, per capita GDP of the nation by 11.3. What that's effectively saying is, when this successfully reaches one tick in Russia here, 148 million. Well, there's a million there, so yeah, I think that's 148 million. Around 148 million people are going to get around $12, and that's going to go straight in the GDP, whatever that number is. I might do the math and take control of one of these countries and show that in a moment, but that's basically how your GDP growth is determined. And if some of you have played Russia games, Russia's a very inviting target. I think a lot of people play Russia. It's a good nation for a lot of reasons. Even if this is unfortunately playing Humanity First is mostly Academy, that's quite annoying. Happens a lot, actually. But Russia just doesn't grow its GDP very well. Sure, you've seen that, where you're only going to be able to grow, even if you try really hard, a couple, maybe $12 billion a week, which is a lot. But compared to the incredible growth of these nations can have is laughable. Very little effort can go into growing the Indian economy, which has, almost 10 times as many people. And you can regularly get $80 billion growth a week out of India without even really trying that hard, without any orgs to boost economy or any space stations. Similar with China, very high population regions. And this is an incredibly important detail that can become overlooked, because it's not just about your GDP and how quickly you can blitz through these numbers. It's about your population and how much all of these will affect that. So pretty much everything, possibly including spoils, everything above here on this side of this list is primarily most concerned with high population regions. Now, this is a very important point to distinguish. You occasionally have pretty high GDP regions that have relatively low populations. And a good example of that is a place like Singapore here. Incredibly high per capita, very high GDP. Population, pathetically low. This population is almost a joke. Even with the core economic region focusing completely on economy 100%, you're going to get very little growth out of this economy. Despite, well, $600 billion GDP isn't a small number. It's actually in the upper, probably top 50, top 20 of nations. It's pretty solid here. Now, the nations like Singapore that have these pretty high numbers but pretty low population, high GDP, low P, high G, little p, are not good for things like economy, welfare, knowledge, unity, all of that. They're really, really bad at it. What's really good for regions like Singapore is a space flight program. You want mission control and you want boost, because when those complete, you just get one physical asset. Now, especially if you watch people, higher tier players, they might refer to certain nations like boost nations or mission control nations or what have you, spaceflight nations. And the reason why is what I just said, where they have low P, big G. So they have the economy to really pump out the spaceflight program and to get the boost and to get the mission control. But they have too little population to really sustainably grow on the scale of these larger nations like India and China can, based on the way this game calculates economy. Now, India and China, I've done Indo-China games, not to completion yet, but pretty far in. They can grow these physical assets very quickly, but it's generally better to use these smaller economies like Bangladesh and Singapore to focus more on constructing mission control and boost. Now, getting onto the way this relates to larger strategies and some new player errors. See, a lot of people, like I said, attracted to Russia and the Eurasian Union. Very strong nation, good starter nation. A lot of players will eat Kazakhstan. That's a classic noob trap. You don't want to eat Kazakhstan. 520 people, or 520 GDP, 520 billion GDP, is a fantastically high amount to focus on mission control and boost. And you can get very high numbers of this in Kazakhstan. It's quite easy to do. And the 20 million they adds to Russia, ties it with Bangladesh. So it's not terrible to do that, but you're just kind of missing out. One of the reasons why Russia and the Eurasian Union make such a very strong nation to play as is getting control of these nations like Romania, theoretically through the expanded Warsaw Pact. Romania, humorously Ukraine, might even be worthwhile releasing Ukraine and adding it to the Eurasian Union diplomatically, or quote unquote diplomatically, rather than annexing it the way this does it, is to turn these nations into major boost nations, major spaceflight nations. They have the economy for it. And they can eventually add to Russia once you've completed at least all the space flights you can in there, and you've got a good amount of boost that you feel comfortable integrating them in with Russia. Especially nations like Romania make fantastic boost because they don't even have core economic zones or resource zones to make them more attractive. So that's just a way to use money and how the system works. So just highlighting the importance of population. Frankly speaking, population is probably way more important than most of these numbers, because population ultimately determines the potential of a country significantly more than I think these far more flexible numbers do. It's very easy to reduce unrest. The democracy scale is a lot harder to influence, but can be very easily shifted, especially in the late game when you apply a lot of pressure, a lot of money, a lot of influence. You can really quickly skyrocket this. especially in the smaller nations. But population is significantly less flexible. And I think this handicap a lot of new players have makes them overlook some nations. For instance, Nigeria is a very strong nation. A lot of people look at Nigeria. I think a lot of new players would look at Nigeria. They see little g and they just go, ew, shitty African nation, and they move on. They don't pay attention. Yes, little g, big P. This big African P here, this is worth a lot. Nigeria can be an incredibly powerful nation because of this population. It's significantly higher than Russia, even after you annex many of these nations. Nigeria is a very strong nation for very low cost because of its low GDP. And you can lower unrest very quickly, and you can raise its economy to very high numbers very quickly. Similar examples, I think, Egypt, really cheap nation. Again, high population. Again, GDP isn't that great, but you can raise your GDP very quickly. You can influence your knowledge a significant amount, and you can do a lot of very powerful plays with these relatively low GDP nations. Again, Ethiopia is pathetically low GDP of $310 billion. It's less than Singapore. I think it's less than Bangladesh. It's, I think, less than even Pakistan. Really small numbers, but relatively large population that you can begin pushing pretty hard. You can easily get, 10 billion GDP from this about every week without trying super hard. Of course, Pakistan. It's typically, keep a good eye out for population, very important number for pretty much all of potential. You typically, ideally want very high population nation, of course, like India, very strong example. China, very strong examples. And you're probably going to want a lot of weaker nations like Bangladesh, who have strong economies, relatively strong economies. But actually, Bangladesh, again, a poor example, pretty high. Better example would be Israel, 14 million, really low, around 500 billion GDP, very strong GDP, low population like Kazakhstan. These make fantastic boost nations. Fantastic. So yeah, there's that. On to a few other resources I know, just a little bit about. You might notice influence fluctuates a lot in game, depending on how long you've been playing the game. Well, this number isn't arbitrary, and it doesn't arbitrarily rise as the game goes on or anything like that. Hold on. It's an intel. This is determinant by your popularity, I believe. Yes, you can see it from the daily income. It's global public opinion. So this determines how much of this you receive. So, of course, Early Game Academy is going to get a lot of this, but depending on how high you raise your public opinion, the more influence you get. And the previously mentioned Indochina campaign I did, I could consistently have, because this is together almost 3 billion people of the almost 8 billion people on the planet. So basically 40% of the globe in perpetual support could make like 7 influence every single day. An absolutely insanely high quantity of influence I had no idea what to do with. But that's just a reference, and emphasizing again the importance of population in this. Population and your approval in those populated nations determines the value of influence you get. Very important. Most of these other numbers, there's no easy way of getting them. Most of them you come from, there's no, I don't think I have any more extra information. You know how to get, this is basically just via organizations to get ops. Most of this is going to come from mission control and boost. You know how it is, and this is, as previously discussed, motivated primarily by keeping middling quantities of democracy, middling quantities of cohesion, high education, makes this number big, and this by default is your daily rate of income. Which, as said, you increase knowledge based on population, so high pop regions are good for this. which adds to the possible importance of things like inequality. Russia actually starts with pretty. Russia and China start with kind of on the higher end. If I let this simulation continue, they actually have increased inequality. They even have less inequality, or no, increased inequality, less equality. A lot of people try and lower this number, and that might be good sometimes, but there is a value of this. Like I said, increasing this number is about causing this number towards the middling value and increasing this number. So it can be advantageous to have high inequality because you will decrease cohesion. In nations like China and Russia, you actually typically want to decrease their cohesion to increase the amount of scientific income you get. So it can actually be advantageous to run no welfare on these types of nations to increase the amount of scientific income you get. Yes. And control points, very important and a little bit hidden. Well, actually, no, I think it's in the blurb if you look over it. You gain this from administration, command, and persuasion abilities. Very important to even in commanders who typically don't use it. I highly recommend administration. Can be extremely important to get that high because it gets you many more organizations that you can use to not only boost administration but command and persuasion and really stack that number up. Again, previously discussed Indo-China game. I had basically everyone up to around 20 administration to deal with the immense quantity of control points controlling both of these countries required, and I needed that to effectively to do that. So if you want to control a lot of regions, it's very important to manage that. And I think that's most of the advice I wanted to give out to new players getting into this game. I'm by no means a pro if such a thing exists at this game at this time. But it's just some things I've learned, sometimes evidently, sometimes a little bit hidden. Little things that maybe if you hadn't read all these things very carefully, you might have missed. Hopefully proved very helpful. Trying to think in case anything else. Oh yes, direct investments. Often overlooked. This can be a very important thing. I can even do this in countries I don't control. No reason I think why you would want to do this, but very important. You can just plug money and influence into nations to automatically buy successes of this. So again, with the previously cited pretty good potential of some of these African nations, especially something like Nigeria, 200 million people, very high population region, and theoretically Ethiopia, especially because it can pretty quickly gobble up these regions here. Lots of potential in some of these African nations. You can, if you have the money and the influence, you can theoretically just buy values in here. So you can absolutely skyrocket GDP and such very, very rapidly when you direct invest. And a good advice towards accumulating the funds you need to do that is the spoils opportunity is significantly more lucrative in nations not only with high GDP, but nations that have these special resource regions in them. So nations like Iraq, if you complete this 51.4 money and 67.6 money per successful tick of spoils in these nations. Meanwhile, trying to find an equivalently valuable nation without a core economic region, you get a measly 48.3. So despite Iraq only having around less than half of the same amount of economy, you're going to get a significantly higher quantity of spoils per successful completion of spoils mission. And that's because of having these resource regions. So if you wanted to do something like an African playthrough, and you wanted to make a lot more usage of direct investment, which you probably should, nations like Saudi Arabia and Iraq and Venezuela can be incredibly valuable because you can essentially use them as ginormous. That's Colombia. Stupid American moment. You can just use these as perfect imperialist targets to just rob and loot these countries for humongous quantities of value. You can easily get several dozen points of successfully completed, especially in these higher GDP regions like Saudi Arabia, and easily get hundreds upon hundreds of dollars every time you successfully complete one of these missions. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty evident. Even with resource regions like India has, completing spoils, although you could complete a lot more because the high GDP gives you the same amount as controlling Saudi Arabia. So robbing a place like Saudi Arabia blind until it's completely ruined as a country to expand the economic potential of Nigeria, weird alt history is a theoretically very powerful, very useful strategy. And that's just some of my hints. I guess one more. The importance of space stations. Now, I just booted up a quick game to look at the map, so I don't quite have the ability to launch and exemplify it at the present moment, and it just seems a little bit too much work to look at the numbers directly on screen. But a lot of all of these space station research potential you have, either from the very beginning of the game or that you get very quickly from some of these early tech trees. They're not even in here. I think they're in here. No, you gotta research them somewhere. Point is, once you unlock them, things like I believe the energy station that isn't unlocked at first, 3% increased boost per station up to a maximum of 30%. Energy stations, of course, pretty expensive to build and maintain to get that maximum benefit. But a 30% boost to boost production is a very significant benefit. So especially, I would know from a lot of Russia games, tend to focus on trying to get those stations up to artificially increase your science amount, because Russia, relatively poor science, given its low GDP and pretty good education values actually, but low population. Means that getting those stations up could be very, very, very beneficial, not only for their scientific output, for the 3% bonus they provide towards your research, but the 3% bonus they provide towards your other industries. So always keep a lookout for those. Very valuable. I know a lot of people get it in their mind. They want to take over the moon, get all these sites. Moon's really shit. You really only need one location, if that, to construct a space constructor. Even the shittiest region, this tiny crater, which tends to spawn with like nothing in it, it's perfectly serviceable. Just build a solar array and a construction array and use that to just boost the supplies into space, because if you don't have the supplies, you just use boost instead. It'll still take time, same amount of time, but significantly less boost to go to Mars, which is the real resource region that you want to compete for. The moon isn't really worth much, not compared, in my opinion, to the immense values of research bonuses you can get out of seizing these interface locations. I think gobbling these up in a game where, especially a Russia game, very important to claim these interface regions and get those massive bonuses to research. Yeah, I think that's all the tips I've learned. I don't know. If I think of more, or if more is left in the comments, feel free to correct me on anything I got wrong. I'm not a prideful man. I know I've probably not encapsulated all the helpful advice I theoretically could, and I certainly don't know everything about this game. So feel free to criticize me or leave more tips in the comments. I don't know, maybe I'll produce another video, part 2, going over some more if I feel like I missed a whole bunch of stuff. This is just some early game tips about how to pick a good country. Things like the European Union, not a terrible choice, but I know a lot of people go for it. There's a lot of theoretical research potential here, good GDP countries, but it's a lot of competition, and I fight tooth and claw. And ultimately, you've got pretty low population. You're competing for, competitive GDP with Russia, but not competitive with China or India, frankly. If you can unify all the EU, you could be a very scary country, but it's just typically easier, especially for new players. I highly recommend that you just go and try and take India, and that's it's way better for you than trying to fight tooth and claw for the European Union from the AI, which typically is very efficient at being extremely annoying in the EU. I know that from personal experience. Very annoying to deal with the AI in Europe. There's a lot more very useful countries that you can just, like Saudi Arabia, you can produce significant amounts of boost and mission control in these very high GDP, relatively low population countries, sub 100 million, barely worth investing in anything up here to increase economy welfare now, which really should just focus on producing the maximum amount of mission control and boost, especially in a country like Iran, which already starts with those finished. Very valuable. But yeah, that's all my tips. Hopefully they're helpful to someone somewhere somehow, and if they're not, I don't know. Sorry for wasting your time. Hope everyone has fun. I love this game. I hope everyone continues to love it too. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.